Welcome to mHTI from my side. I'm going to talk, so Jim talked a lot about the various deep learning models that exist. I'm going to talk about how we can make use of those models in applying it to ML, to solve ML problems. Okay. In particular, I want to talk about relapse risk prediction for smoking cessation. So before I proceed, so Jim Ray was part of this work as well. So he contributed his deep learning expertise in making this possible. And this work, as Vivek mentioned, is funded by NIH, and many parts of the work are also funded by NSF and the University of Memphis. So in general, I guess I'm preaching to the choir that behavioral behavior change is like the holy grail of self-care. And so here is just one diagram to show behaviors are the modifiable factors that has significant impact on both initiation and progression of many chronic diseases, which are the largest burden on the healthcare system, given that we have our healthcare system, inpatient healthcare system, that has been continuously marching ahead with so many amazing improvements. So the next frontier to conquer is indeed the finding a solution to behavior change. And if we focus on just one of these, stress can impact both the physical health, mental health, as well as behavioral and social health. But the great thing about mHealth is that now we have a lot of emerging technologies that have ways to help us get visibility into our daily behaviors. So in our group, we have done a lot of work on using the sensor data collected from these wearables to detect stress, smoking, conversation or stressful conversations, cocaine usage, craving, as well as brushing and flossing behaviors. You see, for each of these problems, there are multiple papers. The reason is that each time we come up with one version, we deploy it, we find that it is still quite deficient. We develop the next version, deploy it again, and it's again find that it is yet to have the maturity that's needed for its real life deployment. And so none of these that I list here are in that sense mature and ready for consumer deployment, but they are promising enough to be used for research. So in our center, so at the MDOT Center, we think about using all these biomarkers derived from wearable sensors in driving behavior change. And behaviors, in health, we know that each person is different physiologically. When we get to the level of behaviors, the differences only grow larger. So each person is different, both in terms of their thoughts, their behaviors, but also in terms of different situations that they encounter. So we want the health interventions that are optimized to each person, to their current state, their current context, and is such that it can keep them engaged for a long time as their thoughts, preferences, and behaviors evolve. So the first component of this is to use the data and the biomarkers derived from these wearable sensors from large-scale observational studies. That can help us discover risk factors for many of these adverse behaviors that have not been known as well, which can be detected directly or automatically or passively from sensor data. And if so, they can provide us new opportunities to both trigger and adapt interventions. And so, so the goal is to do two things. One, to predict when somebody may engage in a risky behavior well in advance, and two, to know as to what is the current dominant risk factor that is about to drive this adverse behavior. So the first one, to know as to when an adverse behavior is about to occur in near future, gives us an opportunity to launch an intervention. Knowing what the dominant risk factors are gives us an opportunity to adapt the intervention so that it has a greater chance to be efficacious. The second part, once we have these risk factors and these predictions in place, then micro-randomized trials could be conducted to find which combinations of which intervention components, using what rules for adaptation, is going to work best for which individuals in what environments. And so that can be done with a combination of micro-randomized trial designs and reinforcement learning. And the third part, once we have found an optimal rule, optimal policy and for an mHealth intervention, then we need to deploy it in real life. And the deployment in real life also involves many challenges, such as finding ways to efficiently implement these biomarkers, these intervention policies on limited battery devices, and where we don't have a lot of computing power. And the last component is that because these biomarkers are reveal a lot of the daily behaviors that we engage in a day-to-day basis, they provide us power to help somebody change behaviors, but at the same time, they also pose a huge responsibility because they reveal a lot about us, many of which we may not want to be revealed publicly. So they raise privacy issues as well, which we need to protect while still trying to help each individual. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus more on the first part, which is how do we predict risky behaviors and to discover what the dominant risk factors are. And I'm going to focus on one example today, which is a smoking cessation. So smoking has a huge adverse impact on people. It can damage many parts of our body, and its death toll is staggering, as is its economic toll on our healthcare system. And so it is one of the largest cause of death. But the main issue is that there is a big gap between when people take up smoking and when the adverse effects begin to show up, at which time it becomes very hard to quit smoking. And indeed, many people, they take up smoking when they didn't know as well, and they don't see any immediate harmful effects in the near term. But when they do become more educated, they do try to quit, and most of them try to quit, but very few succeed. Most of them lapse, and if they lapse once in their cessation attempt, they usually go back to full relapse. So if we want to use mHealth to address a smoking cessation, we think of it in terms of a pipeline. First, we need to develop mHealth technology so that we can detect when a smoking lapse happens. So the traditional approach is to have people self-report when a smoking lapse happens, but that may not be precise in the time location. If it's not in the time location, somebody lapsed when they were outside the building, in their a corner of their office, outside their office building, but they report it once they are back in office. We don't know as to what location was conducive to smoking. Right. So similarly, when somebody was at a gas station, they saw an advertisement or saw the cigarettes, and then they purchased and then lapsed, but report when after they lapse in home, again, we may not know exactly as to what led to the lapse. So detecting the smoking passively so that we know when the smoking lapse happens is the first step. Second step is then to be able to predict well in advance so that we can prevent that first lapse from occurring, which usually leads to full relapse. And then once we know the risk factors, then we can adapt the interventions dynamically. So, so the first part is how do we detect smoking? So our approach has been to use both hand-to-mouth gestures and the deep inhalation and exhalation that is associated with smoking. what you see here is that in this clean version of the signal, the smoking puff is quite visible, and we see that right where there is a hand-to-mouth gesture on the accelerometer signal at the bottom, and then there is this deep inhalation and exhalation on the respiration signal at the top. And we see that the signals during walking or eating, they look different than they look during smoking. Now, this is easier said than done when you take this model developed for this smoking detection on a field study ride, that many things break. But so we developed a model of machine AI model to detect this smoking puffs, and then we deployed it on a smartphone. That was used to detect when a lapse occurred. And so so I should mention that there are so by now we have deployed this technology in many studies, and we have since learned many of the scenarios where it breaks. But happy to talk towards the end. And by the way, if there are any questions, please feel free to jump in. So suppose we have this approach to detect smoking, and so we know as to when smoking happens. Then there are two ways that we can intervene. The first one is, so in terms of just-in-time or sensor-triggered intervention. First is, if we detect a smoking lapse happened, then an automatic phone call from therapist could come, or an intervention could be launched on the device itself. So the aim would be to prevent any subsequent lapse. But only if somebody is wearing the sensor will you detect a lapse, and then if the model was able to detect. So there are many cases where the smoking detection may not be captured, and if so, then there is nothing that can be done in terms of mHealth intervention triggering from wearable. Second approach is predict it well in advance. And so this will depend upon detecting the high-risk situations, for example, those that are cues in the environment, or other antecedents that may increase the chances of a smoking lapse, such as stress or craving. So we are going to right now focus on the second approach. So then we ask, why do smokers lapse? And a lot of the studies have been done using EMAs, and they have revealed a lot of with scenarios as to that leads to a smoker to lapse in their cessation attempt. One is the stress. Second is craving. Those are internal triggers. Then external triggers are seeing somebody else smoke, or seeing a smoking spot where there are lots of burned cigarettes, or exposure to alcohol, or exposure to a cigarette store. So geo-exposures. So, but fortunately now we do have sensors that people carry with them, which can be used for these for detecting these risk factors. We can use a smartwatch to detect stress and potentially craving as well, which is related to a stress. Related to a stress, meaning that craving also usually can elevate stress. So stress indirectly can provide a way to detect craving, which we have shown in one of the works. Now, there's the geo-exposure, whether it is the smoking spots, seeing some others smoking, seeing the cigarette point of sale, or bars where alcohol is served. Each of these can potentially be detected using a combination of location that can be detected from GPS and accelerometers on these smartwatches that can detect walking. I'll go through each of these one by one. So first is stress detection. Stress detection has many independent utility, but in this case for smoking, it is one of the risk factors. We have been, as I mentioned previously, we have been looking at ways to detect stress from wearables for the 15 years. And so I will try to be brief in this journey to say as to how we went about it and where the state of stress detection is today. So, so the training for training an AI model for stress, we use the data collected in lab setting instead of using the self-report, because self-report is a lot noisier and has a lot more variability. So from the lab study, it's when participants are subjected to a stress protocol, which are validated, we know that it's going to stress out most of the participants, and therefore those minutes when participants were under a stress challenge were labeled as a stress, and otherwise when they were at baseline or recovery labeled as not stress. So using this AI model was trained, and it provided good performance on the lab data. So we see as the F1 score, if we use the entire model, it was about 0.81 with accuracies or the hit rates or area under curve in 90s. Now, we also noticed that using HRV features alone only provided an F1 score of only 0.56, but using many other features that we combined for ECG, it elevated it to about 0.78. So that was what we learned out of this lab study. Then we also tested it in the field, comparing it to the self-report that participants provided. And we found that the median F1 score, even in the field, was about 0.71, given that the self-report has a consistency of only 0.8 or so. So meaning that you can't aim for F1 score of 100, close to 100, if the item with which you are comparing only has consistency score of about 0.8. So 0.71 was pretty good. But all of this data or this analysis was after the data was collected, students did their best to find the best performance, train the best model. Okay. So what happens when you take this technology for a ride in the field, okay, in real life? So meaning that after you collect the data, you don't, if you don't, have it deployed in the field, let people and do it in a large scale study. So in the first paper here is from 2018, where they had they recruited about 1,000 participants who wore this chest belt or the ECG for 5 days continuously and provided self-report of stress. Even after doing this post hoc modeling, that means after collecting the data, trying to find the best model, the best F1 score they were able to accomplish was 0.42, which is marginally better than baseline of 0.36. So not great, right? So only 18% of the participants had an F1 score of greater than 0.66. So that was 2018 with the ECG. Then more recent work, this is from 2022. Here also they had about 597, about 600 participants. This time they wore the sensors for more than 50 days, so about 8 weeks. This time, instead of collecting the data and then doing your best to find the best model, they analyze the the accuracy of a Garmin stress score. So Garmin watches provide a stress score, and they do so in real time. And what they found was the Spearman rank correlation with self-report was about 0. And when they looked for the Spearman rank correlation for HRV features collected from the watch, it's about 0.01. So yes, in research, when we task the students to find the best models on a collected data, they're able to do a lot of magic to provide models and report correlations or the accuracies in even 90s. But when you fix a model and you deploy it in the field and then just do the analysis, it doesn't work very well so far. And so the question is why? And if you are a health researcher who wants to use the stress assessment in your studies, then you need a stress assessment to work in real time. So why is it that these stress models have not worked very well? So the first answer is wide between person differences. So, I mean, in terms, so what you see here is the ECG mean heart rate under different ratings of stress that participants provided. That's what you see at the top. And at the bottom, what you see is that classification performance on different participants. As I mentioned, only 18% of the participants had an F1 score of more than 0.66, so they are the high. But then you see, their PSS score is lowest. And those who had an F1 score that was below 0.33, they are on the low side, and you see their PSS score was high. So, and you continue to see that kind of difference across other scales as well. So between percent differences are very, very significant, and not accounting for that is one of the major reasons. The second reason is that when people are asked to report their stress state currently, how are you feeling now? Then it reflects the stress experiences they may have had right 2 minutes ago, or 30 minutes ago, or 2 hours ago, depends upon how big of a stressor it was. So what you see on the right is the perception of a stress, meaning people's self-report of a stress. How long does it take for them to recover after a stressor? And you see it, it takes about 300 minutes. Okay. Now, physiology, how quickly does that recover? So if you had a stressor, I don't know, notification from mHTI, or notification of a grant, or notification of a paper, or any a conflict, any of the stressors, if it is a major stressor, it will take a long time for it to subside from your mind in terms of what you self-report. But on your physiology, it recovers within minutes. And that's what you see on the left. So if we ask somebody to report their current stress level, and then we look at the physiology, we don't know as to which physiological measurement, 2 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, 100 minutes ago, which one is it that represents the experience of that stressor for which they are providing their stress level. But in terms of labeled data from the field, we look at the participants, the report of how are you feeling now, and we look at the physiological data from 30 minutes, from now up until 30 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, 1 hour ago. So the second paper I talked about, they looked at all possible combinations to find the best window of measurement from the moment the self-report was taken to see what correlation they could get. And so this dyssynchrony, lack of synchrony between how long it takes physiology to recover and the self-rating to recover is what is the second major reason. There are other reasons too. So what the approach we took to get around this is, instead of just detecting what the stress state is now, we look for the episode. So that means physiology, if it shows a response to a stressor, it rises and then falls like a stock market. So we look at the entire episode and we isolate that episode to say, this is when there was a physiological response that looked like was from a stressor. And so it may look like this. Okay. And so then next what we do is we ask we deployed this similar to that Garmin stress score. We deployed our stress model in a Fossil smartwatch. And after this entire episode was detected, then we prompted the participants at some of the select times, and we asked them, from this time to this time, there was an event that was detected. What was going on? So provide your stress rating, not now, but during when this event was occurring. And then if they say that, yes, they were stressed or probably stressed, then we ask them, okay, so what was the stressor? So this study went on for more than, so many participants participated for 100 days, some have participated for even 170 days. And so, so with doing this, the correlation, the same as Spearman rank correlation that we were able to achieve is about 0.28. If you compare this to the Spearman rank correlation for cortisol, which is like the stress hormone, that's about 0.46. So 0.28, that's for all the participants, including those for whom their physiology and their self-report almost is never in sync. That means some always report a stress, some never report a stress. So without excluding any participants, it's about 0.28. If you exclude some of them, then it gets to about in 30s. So that's the progress in terms of stress detection. But again, if you ask me, I will describe many ways that even this model can break. Okay. So I talked about detecting the lapse triggers. First, we talked about stress. The next is to talk about the geo-exposure. So for geo-exposure, we want to detect when participants are experiencing potent cues, exposed to those. So for that, what we do is that using GPS data, we do a clustering to find places where people spend significant time. There are some places where they spend a lot more time than others. So there are some that are significant places, and the others that are transient places, but all of these are dwell places. What we found is that, if they spend more than 6 minutes there, then we deem that as a place either significant or transient. Okay. Next, what we are trying to detect is micro locations. So that means you may be at office, but you're not sitting in your office all the time. When you step out of the building, you could be exposed to a smoking spot. Similarly, when you are at your home, there could be a spot where you usually go to smoke. And so if you step out and go there, then that's the micro location, and that can potentially expose you to the potent cues when you are in your quit attempt. So to detect those, we look at the physical activity and the GPS signal strength. Okay. So now we use both of those, and we trained a model, again, another AI model. This time, the goal was to detect which locations are more conducive to smoking, and we call them smoking spots. Okay. So we looked at what participants provided in terms of smoking events. We detected when the puff marker model detected that they smoked. We confirmed that they also said so in a neighboring EMA, and so that we are not using any false detections from the model. We also looked at what they said in terms of whether smoking was allowed there or not. All of this is done during pre-quit data when they are smoking regularly. Okay. So then we look at these micro locations as to how proximal they are to that location. And so then we looked at both the probability or frequency of a smoking occurrence at those locations, and then whether smoking was allowed in those locations. So what you see here are some both personal smoking spots and general smoking spots. General smoking spots are those places where many participants are known to have smoked. Personal smoking spots are those places where this individual smoked. And so what you see is that places of worship where we see that the smoking occurrence is low, both the proximal and the distal, meaning that whether they are closed inside the premise or even in the vicinity. Similarly, the medical places, that means those that may be hospitals or so on, there, if they are, we see that the smoking allowance is also low and the smoking occurrence is also low, but the same medical, you'll see that if you are not proximal, that means if you are more than 30 meters away, then, or 100 feet away, then those same medical, that becomes a general smoking spot. Okay. So using this, we are able to assign the likelihood of a location being a personal smoking spot or a general smoking spot, and then we have the stress detection. So we want to now use both of these as well as the activity to predict as to when the lapse may occur and then detect why the lapse may occur. So we observe. So we use the data collected in the current hour and summarize the information from the history, and we want to predict what is the likelihood of this individual lapsing in the next hour. Okay. So for internal risk factors, we use the stress. For external risk factors, we use the smoking opportunity context that I talked about. So for this case, we use a smoking cessation study data set that had people wear these sensors for 4 days pre-quit and 10 days post-quit. So there are several challenges in developing such an AI model. The first challenge is that so if we had full label data, no issues. But what labels can we really have for the data? So for knowing as to when the lapse occurred, we rely on this sensor-based detection, puff marker. But puff marker sometimes detects, other times does not detect. So we only have a small number of lapses in the post-quit phase that we know to have occurred. So we don't have all the times when the lapse occurred labeled. So we have then the unlabeled data where some lapses may have occurred and may not have occurred. Second, when the lapse occurred, we assign it as a high risk. That means these were high risk situations. But when a lapse does not occur, it's possible that there were high risk, but the participant was able to tolerate, overcome. And so those are also in that unlabeled data. So what we have is small amount of positive labels, and then the entire rest of the data that may have positive labels, may have negative labels, and all mixed. And then we have several other issues of missingness and imperfect ML models and sampling alignments. So in collaboration with Jim, we developed a deep learning AI model that takes all of the noisy sensor measurements, derives various biomarkers with respect to stress and the location, and then summarize the entire history in terms of the decaying influence of the previous events on the propensity to lapse in the current moment, and then we use that to train for the model training. But as I mentioned, the other issue is that we have only a small amount of positive labels. So we're trying to denote the scenario here. As you can see, there are lots of unlabeled low risk, lots of some unlabeled high risk, and there are some positive labeled high risk. So that's the mixture of data we have. So for that, we came up with an approach, a loss function that can guide the model to still be able to distinguish high risk from low risk situation despite this noisy labels. Okay, so using this the deep learning model and the new loss function, we were able to train this model, and we this time simulated it on the already collected data, and assuming so what we wanted to detect was that when the lapses have occurred, in how many of these lapses occur within 1 hour of when the model says that the individual is at high risk. And so we find that we can do so for 85% of the lapses if we are willing to have about 5.5 such intervention opportunities per day. So because if you are so we can achieve 100% recall if every time the model says that person is at high risk. So, but then that's going to result that the model is not useful at all because many of them will be false positive. So a measure, because here we don't have that way to measure false positive. So the way to constrain the model is to how to minimize the number of opportunities that the model says the person is at high risk. So, so what I show here is that when we look at the risk scores that is produced by the model, what do we see prior to a lapse? So what we see prior to a lapse is that about 44 minutes prior to a lapse occurring is when we see the lapse score peaking. So which provides enough time to intervene. And mind you, this is population data. So meaning that this signal is visible even when we average across the entire population. And then what we show here is one individual's risk score throughout the entire day. So this shows the dynamics of how the risk goes up and down. So you see that the risk peaks 2 times in this case. And what happens is that the lapse, as you see, happens, the red line, and that's after the risk has come down, which is what we saw in the previous graph as well, that the risk peaks about 44 minutes before the lapse. And in this case, the person also self-reported that they lapsed, but you see this is about half an hour later. Yeah. So in terms of major risk factors, we found that the environmental and behavioral cues are most informative. Basically, time since the last visit to a smoking spot, that was the most useful feature. And then a fraction of the stay duration at the smoking spots was also a very useful feature. Average duration of activity events until observation, that also points to walking towards a smoking spot, also a useful feature. But 9 of the top 15 are actually stress related. So stress and location, they are both have a major influence. Okay, so that's what we have done so far. There are lots that still needs to be done for this work. This is post-facto analysis or model building. That means this model is yet to be implemented on a watch or on a phone so that it can be used in research studies to discover various intervention ideas. This model again has not been validated in the field, meaning that we only evaluated it on already collected data where we had an option to find the best model possible or best performance possible. When this is deployed on a watch and then and put it out in the field, then we will know as to how well it works in the field. Then if it does have the similar capability, then we can launch into micro-randomized trial to find as to what interventions are best suited to launch when the risk is low, what interventions are best suited to launch when the intervention is when the risk is high, what interventions are best suited when the intervention is high because of stress, what interventions are best suited when the intervention is high because of location or different risk factors. And then if once we discover some promising interventions, then conduct reinforcement learning-based micro-randomized trial to find the best policies. And then if all of this proves well, then hopefully someday it can get rolled out into the field and help real people. So this is all I had for you today. I'm happy to take any questions. Vivek, you'll have to unmute. All the beautiful things you said.
I just saying thank you so much. We have a group of substance abuse and smoking researchers, so I'll give it to our scholars.
Hi, my name is John. Very interesting research. Thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding the stress algorithms that you were getting from the watches. Has any of that data been observed in pediatrics? I'm a pediatric GI doc interested in chronic pain.
No, it's all adults. It's not in pediatric. So in pediatric, like the base heart rate itself is higher and so on, right? So, but the model is self-calibrating. So I would be hopeful, but we have not yet done it on any pediatric patients.
Interesting. Thanks. And
something interesting to pursue.
So you're saying there is potential that it could be adjusted for different age ranges? Because
because the model adjusts to each individual's physiology.
Oh,
so
okay.
it does personalize over time. So I'm hopeful, but I can't say anything until we test it out.
No, that's good to know. Thank you.
So
Okay.
while you're thinking about it, I mean, so I mentioned that there are lots of ways the technology can break when you take it out in the field. So one way, I mean, the smoking detection broke in several studies that we deployed it, is because the smoking detection depends upon hand-to-mouth gestures, detecting hand-to-mouth gestures. So when we take our hand to the mouth, then there is, the accelerometer has 3 axes. So different axes, or gyroscope too. So different axes measure different things. And accelerometer is affected by gravity. So so if y-axis is pointing this way, right, then that's what experiences the largest motion when you take your hand to the mouth, right? So the algorithm had pre-configured that this particular axis is y-axis, and this is where we are looking for the largest motion. And what happened is that midway, some of the hardware configuration changed, and this y-axis, which was this way, became this way. And so the model was expecting the largest motion on this axis, which was not happening, right? Because this axis became lateral, and therefore it failed to detect many of the smoking episodes. So more recently, so we found it out a lot later, and many of the studies are close to conclusion. So now we have developed a version that looks at the walking events. And during walking, people have their hand swings, and during the hand swinging, the largest motion change that happens is again in the same axis that is involved in the hand to mouth. And so during walking, we are able to detect as to which is that axis. So now it doesn't matter whether somebody wears it this way, somebody wears it under hand, switches it from left hand to right hand. Now it should work, but again, it has not been tested. So that's one way that we saw that the smoking detection, which was working nice beforehand, then it didn't work as well. And then now we know, and therefore now we have to write the next paper for smoking. So after detecting that vulnerability.
Santosh, let me ask a general question. So you run the mDOT Center, which is a national resource funded by the NIBIB, and your team of technologists. How can our mHealth scholars, particularly the clinical implementers, use you or access your resource and without burdening the process too much? Any insights or thoughts?
Yeah, a very nice question, Vivek. So, the goal of mDOT Center is to get these technologies out in the hands of researchers. So there are several technologies that are nearing that level of maturity. So, for example, the stress model that I talked about, that is now available to be deployed, to be tested, or to be used in various research studies. So, because now it has been tested out in the real field environment, we saw that many of the EMAs are now being used for EMIs, meaning that you collect EMAs and then you use the responses provided by participants in deciding what interventions to launch and how to adapt the intervention. But what we found in this MOONS study is that there we were trying to collect the stressors. What are the daily stressors? So there also, similarly, we wanted to prompt the participants when they were more likely to be under stress. And so what we see is that using this model on the smartwatch, we were able to increase the chances of catching a participant when they were under stress from about 15% to 50%. So that means using this model can significantly reduce the number of prompts you need to catch people in stressful moments if your target involves addressing stress or doing something in response to stress. So that technology is now available. If anyone wants is interested in collaborating to take this further. Second, so there is this imputation. So a lot of missing data issues are observed, And so one of our TRDs has developed imputation approaches for activity imputation, those from Fitbit. And so what we are now doing is that, so all of us has collected a large amount of Fitbit data. And so we are applying those imputation methods on that data itself, so that anyone looking to do research with the all of us data will be able to use both the raw data, the data provided by Fitbit and the imputed version produced by using the MDOT technology. Third technology is for those who want to do reinforcement-based just-in-time adaptive interventions. So we are now in the process of creating a web-based service where people can generate code or the methods to deploy this reinforcement learning-based approaches for just-in-time adaptive interventions. So these are some of the approaches. So there are some of the technologies that are in the various stages of readiness to be used by the community.